there should be enough rational thinking people, even if they hate Russia in the West, to recognize that there's an end game to this, that this can't just go on like this forever, and you can't wish your way to something good. I mean, I say that I think that they're intelligent, but yet I still keep seeing these things. How do you do that dichotomy between saying something that we allegedly know is not true and then seeing where this is likely to go from the Western perspective?
Well, these people in the West who are advocating more war are deeply invested in this conflict. And if Ukraine loses and Russia wins, this is a devastating blow to their reputation. It's a stain on their reputation. They don't want to be seen as being responsible for the destruction of Ukraine. So their view is, if we can just continue on, maybe at some point in time the Russians will collapse or something will happen, and we will be able to reverse the tide in Ukraine.
So it really is hope as a method. They just hope that what the rational objective says that this almost certainly will come out. Like they just hope that that doesn't come to pass.
Yeah, well, the evidence to support that, Danny, is that nobody tells a plausible story based on facts and logic as to how we stem the tide and then turn the tide against the Russians. You just can't tell that story with facts and logic at this point in time. All the facts and logic point to a Russian victory. And in my opinion, if the war goes on, the only interesting question is how much territory the Russians end up conquering. My view is that the best you can hope for is that the Russians only take those 4 oblasts in the east that they now basically control. They don't completely control them, but basically control, and the Donbass, and Crimea. That's what we should hope is the limit of Russian territorial expansion. But if you continue this war, I think the Russians are going to end up taking even more territory, which is going to be disastrous for Ukraine. And it's going to make the West even look worse than they're now going to look once we get some sort of peace settlement.
Yeah, I remember on our show last year, you dropped a bombshell that you thought that it would end up being 8 provinces, not 4. And unfortunately, we seem to still be on that track.
Well, I would say if I were playing Putin's hand, I'd want more territory. From Ukraine's point of view, I don't want to see the Russians take any more territory than those 4 oblasts plus Crimea. But the problem that the Russians face is they can't trust the West. They can't trust Ukraine. And they have to plan for a rainy day. They have to plan for the possibility that Ukraine and the West will come back after them in a couple of years, should you get a frozen conflict. And should that be the case, if you're Russians, you want to control as much territory as possible. So They're very powerful strategic incentives for the Russians to take more territory.
Yeah, couldn't agree with you more. One other area I want to talk about here before we shift gears into a couple of other issues related to this attempt, anyway, to get to a ceasefire and an end of war negotiations. And that was talked on British television today by Michael Clark on Sky News. And he brought up something that is, a lot of people haven't mentioned it lately, but they do periodically keep going back to it. And that is that the real seeds of this disaster are that Putin lied, not just in the Minsk Accords, but all the way back to the Budapest memorandum.
The biggest one of all, I suppose, was 1994, the Budapest memorandum, which is when Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons that it had inherited from the old Soviet Union, and Ukraine was the one country that could have used them. I mean, the other countries, Kazakhstan and Belarus, they couldn't really have done anything with the weapons that they inherited, but Ukraine had the expertise. They could have had their own nuclear force that would have worked if they'd chosen to, but they gave it up in 1994 in return for security guarantees from, guess who? Russia, America and Britain. And so the Russians drove a coach and horses through that in 2014 when they invaded and took Crimea. Britain and America just kind of pretended it had all gone away. We sort of pretended we'd forgotten that we'd given the security guarantees 20 years before. So, I mean, that was the big one.
So let's, there's a lot of things to pick out in there. Let's start with this first one. Did the Budapest memorandum actually provide for security guarantees that the United States and Great Britain would go to war against Russia if they were violated?
No, we explicitly did not give them security guarantees. unsurprisingly, the Ukrainians wanted security guarantees then, just as they want security guarantees now. What we gave them were security assurances. It's very important to understand that. No security guarantee, a security assurance. And there was a very important caveat that was thrown in. And basically, what was written down was that none of the countries would threaten or invade Ukraine except in self-defense. Except in self-defense. That was the qualifier that was thrown in. And the Russians, of course, would justify what they did by saying they invaded Ukraine in self-defense. They view this as a preventive war. They thought that NATO, in expanding eastward to include Ukraine in the alliance, was creating an existential threat and acting in self-defense. They took Crimea in 2014, and then they invaded in February 2022.
And from an international realist point of view, to what extent would you say that also what did not exist in 1994 was NATO expansion on the table of coming into Ukraine? That didn't happen until 2008 when it was first talked about in the NATO meeting there. But would that have changed the dynamics anyway? Because of now Russia feels a threat coming up on their border, according to them.
Well, just to put this in context, when we took away or we forced Ukraine to give up its nuclear weapons, NATO expansion was not a serious issue. The Clinton administration decided on NATO expansion at the end of 1994, and we had pushed Ukraine to give its nuclear weapons up in 1993 and early 1994. And the whole question of Ukraine coming into NATO wasn't on the table. And as you point out, the whole question of Ukraine and NATO was not an issue until April of 2008. So the decision is made to expand NATO in 94. This is after Ukraine has given up its nuclear weapons, right? The decision is made to expand NATO in 94. The first tranche of expansion is 99. The second tranche of expansion is 2004. And in those first two tranches, Ukraine is not an issue. It's in April 2008 when the decision is made to bring Ukraine into NATO. And at that point, of course, Ukraine has no nuclear weapons. So you see that what people like Michael Clark and others did, and you want to understand that Michael Clark was not arguing that Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons in 1993 or early 1994. He was fully in favor of Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. So he left Ukraine. People like him left Ukraine in a vulnerable position. And then people like him who were enthusiastic about NATO expansion pushed Ukraine to seriously countenance joining the alliance. And this was a prescription for disaster because the Russians made it clear that this was not going to happen and that they would destroy Ukraine before they would let it come into the alliance. So people like Michael Clark over time have played a key role in the destruction of Ukraine. And it's quite amazing to me to listen to them talk now as if, you know, they were advocating the right thing in 1993, 94, and that their decision to bring Ukraine into NATO was a wise decision. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Michael Clarks of this world deserve to be blamed for what has happened in Ukraine. They deserve to be blamed for this catastrophe because they played a key role in bringing it on.
And you know, he also inherent in his argument there is his claim that, you know, guess who? The UK and the United States allowed Russia to just run roughshod over that and invade in 2022, aside from the alleged security guarantees, not assurances, that he said, because of the Budapest memorandum. And so I would ask, are you advocating that in light of what you thought was a security guarantee from the Budapest memorandum, that we should have gone to war with Russia in 2022? I mean, that question deserves to be answered.
No, well, he's, like most people in the West, they're perfectly content to let huge numbers of Ukrainians die so as to bleed the Russians white, while we sit back and continue to lead a good life. It's very easy to argue that we should continue this war and we should continue throwing Ukrainian bodies into the meat grinder when it's not, British bodies or American bodies or Western bodies more generally. That's really what's going on here. People now are arguing that Russia's this great threat, and what we have to do is bleed the Russians white. And of course, we have the ideal ally to do that job. Always the question when you get into a war like this is who's going to pay the blood price? That's what really matters. The economic price matters for sure, but the question is who's going to pay the blood price? And it's quite clear that it's the Ukrainians who are paying the blood price. We are not paying the blood price. So the Michael Clarks of the world are perfectly happy to continue throwing Ukrainian bodies into the meat grinder.
Yeah, and that's one of the things that is a personal, real point of anger and disappointment and frustration for me. Looking further into Europe and talking about some more of the chaos that's going around and how this war is going to end, where it's going to end, if it's going to end. We had last weekend, and actually, I think today there's actually a meeting in Europe among some of their military folks about this coalition of the willing and this robust peace force that they're thinking about putting in after some mythical agreement that somehow Russia would agree to that would allow NATO troops on any flag to come in, even though Russia has been categorically against that. But still, they're having this meeting claiming this. Well, at the same time, in the news today is that Emmanuel Macron is starting to throw around the war tag. He's saying that France issues its citizens with an invasion guide, how to survive a nuclear attack after Macron warned Europe must prepare for war. I got to think if you're talking about trying to find an end to a war, or if you're thinking about should we continue fighting and you think there's a chance that you're going to end up with nuclear war, seems like it would be in your interest to get this thing off the table by whatever means necessary. What do you make of this?
I agree with you. I don't know what to say. I find it hard to understand what he's thinking. Both he and Keith Starmer appear to me to be living on another planet where facts and logic don't matter. I just kind of don't understand what they're doing. A coalition of the willing that's led by France and Britain. This is just going to go nowhere. I mean, first of all, as you said, the Russians are not going to let these people in as peacekeepers. But even if they did, they don't have the capability to do much of anything. There's not much military power there. I mean, they're pretending, the British and the French are pretending that they can give security guarantees to Ukraine, that they can come to the defense of Ukraine. This is not a serious argument. Zelensky has made the point very clearly. There's only one country on the planet that can give Ukraine meaningful security guarantees, and that country is the United States of America. And we have made it clear we're not going to give them a security guarantee. And the idea that the French and the British are, and that they're going to take up the slack as we begin to slither away from Europe, I wouldn't bet a lot of money on that.
Right. Yeah. It's not a good place to invest your cash if you're looking to get a good investment return. You mentioned earlier in this show that really what's on the table right now is a recognition of reality and only losing the 4 oblasts that have already been annexed by the Russian Federation into their territory. Crimea, of course, will stay on the Russian side. Or you can ignore reality and keep going. There is some news out of the Institute for the Study of War earlier today that gives plausibility to that and actually quantifies it a little bit based on some comments coming out of Russia. Thanks, Gary. This was today in the Institute for the Study of War, published this morning about yesterday's update. It says the Kremlin continues to demand that Ukraine cede Ukrainian territory that Russia does not currently occupy and set conditions to make further territorial demands. Russian business outlet Kommersant reported on March 18th that its sources that Russian President Vladimir Putin stated at a private meeting that Russia would not claim Odessa and other territories if unspecified countries recognize the administrative borders of those 4 territories. So President Putin allowed to be leaked that basically he just agreed with what you said. If we agree right now, that's where the territorial losses stop. But Putin also recently claimed that Novorossiya, which one of our guests mentioned a minute ago, is an integral part of Russia. And Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said that Novorossiya is all of eastern and southern Ukraine, including the Odessa Oblast. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky stated on March 18th, that Russian forces are concentrating in Kursk Oblast and on the border with Sumy Oblast, and may be preparing for new attacks on Sumy, Kharkiv, and in the southern part of the Zaporozhye Oblast. So militarily, there's a lot of things going on there. You see there's the Kherson down there in the lower part, Kharkiv in the upper part, and Sumy kind of in the center of the top. There are Russian large-scale formations that appear to be poised where they could actually launch into Ukraine and to take even more territory. And one wonders if this is a signal from Moscow that we can either do it the easy way or we can do it the hard way. But one of these two things is going to come about. How do you see that?
I agree. I think we, and especially the Ukrainians, have a deep-seated interest in getting an agreement in place now and making sure that the Russians don't physically control oblasts like Odessa and Kharkiv. I mean, it's just in Ukraine's interests. And the idea that they're going to be able to prevent that from happening and, in fact, roll back the Russian gains of the past few years is delusional. It's not going to happen. If anything, the Russians are on the march. Yes, they're moving slowly, but it is a steamroller, and they're likely to pick up speed moving forward. It's imperative from Ukraine's point of view, in my humble opinion, to stop this now and to cut a deal, given the 4 oblasts and Crimea are lost, but nothing else is lost. If you go on here, you're going to lose more territory. Once the Russians capture territory, it's going to be very difficult to dislodge them. And the reason is that there are powerful incentives for the Russians to keep more territory than they now have.